We talk Buckeyes every Wednesday night here at Mark Rogers TV with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry. And I know that it's kind of a dead spot in the college football calendar, but there's always plenty to talk about, especially trying to get you ready for the beginning of fall camp the first week of August, and set as college football fans with some of the guys that you may see a little bit more prominently, not necessarily more because these guys played quite a bit in 2016, but more prominently for the Buckeyes here starting the first week of September. Brandon, we're going to talk about some possible breakout players. Demario McCall is a guy that got into 5 games last season, had some pretty decent efforts in the Big Ten, not just against the cupcakes outside of the conference, but against the likes of Nebraska, Maryland, Rutgers, played significant time and looked the part.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely looked pretty impressive there at times, but you got to consider, too, that most of his competition was against the lower caliber type of teams. The best team that he really played against was were the Cornhuskers when the Buckeyes were kind of in control of that game from the start. With that said, he looked very impressive at times. Rushed for 270 yards on the year, 84 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. Big question for him really is going to be where does he play? Is he going to stick at running back and back up Mike Weber and purely do that? Are they going to move him around, slide him into the H-back role like the rumors kind of were there, where he would jump in and take Curtis Samuel's spot? So the big thing with him is I think he's going to have a much larger role than he did last year. But the big thing really is just going to be where is it going to be at? Is he going to take that role as a running back or as a wide receiver, or are they going to be able to mix him in and do a little bit of both? But anytime you get a Ohio kid that is ready to make that next step, it's fun to watch as a Buckeye fan. And I think this year, Buckeye fans know all about him. There's the lore of Demario and just how great he has looked at time. But I think, the national scene's really going to be able to see how good of a player he is. And while he may not start any games this year, I think they're really going to become familiar with how dynamic of a player he is. And moving forward next year when he takes over the running back role, possibly, people will be ready for him.
Jerome Baker is a guy that the recruiting services loved coming out of Cleveland St. Benedictine, third-rated player in the state of Ohio, number 4 athlete, according to 247 Sports, and a guy that just didn't see much of the field with only 3 games and a handful of tackles his first season. Then last year we saw how good he could be, and maybe he turns out to be a monster this year, but he had 9.5 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks. Last year, Brandon, and Jerome Baker, when he's got his game together, we may see a real breakout disruptor kind of guy that is on the level of some of the other guys we've seen, Myles Garrett, Derek Barnett, somebody like that coming up his next 2 years.
It's funny with, somebody that had 83 tackles last year, had pick 6 against Oklahoma, had quite a few sacks, a few different picks, that we consider him a breakout type of player. But outside of Columbus, outside of a few Big Ten fans, you really don't hear the name Jerome Baker too much. Out of all the guys that we talk about, I think Jerome Baker is going to take the biggest leap. I think he's really going to come into his own this year, having his first year going into the season as a starter. If you remember last year, he was a backup heading into the season, and then Booker went down. Baker just kind of got that starting job and ran with it. So he's had most of last season, all of the offseason as a starter. And I think Baker's really going to explode onto the scene. I think he's very much a possibility if someone's going to leave early next year and jump in and be a first-round pick. I think he's got that type of talent. He's got that type of Ryan Shazier, Darren Lee type of talent where he can impact the game from a few different spots. He's fast enough to cover. The big question with him coming out of high school was where was he going to play too, because he was a linebacker and a running back. There were some schools that wanted him as a running back. So Baker's got the speed. The big thing with him is just putting on more and more muscle weight and trying to bulk up without maintaining or without losing that speed. So I think Baker is going to be a fun one to watch, and I really think he's going to be the player on defense this year.
Yeah, and the talent that surrounds him is just tailor-made for him to have a huge year, because one guy can't be concentrated on by the blocking scheme, and there's just going to be opportunities for him beyond just physically dominating one or two blockers, having some openings when the situation presents itself. Brandon, who was the last guy? I lost track of who you said your third guy was.
Denzel Ward.
Denzel Ward.
Denzel Ward, yep.
All right. Makes sense. All right. Talking Ohio State football with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry each and every Wednesday night. You can catch us live going forward each and every Wednesday night. We will send out the link on Twitter as well as the individual segments as we get you set for August camp. We're breaking down really good players that have already shown that they belong at this level, but could really break onto the national scene. And we last highlighted Jerome Baker, and I think he definitely fits that category. The Buckeye secondary loaded last year, of course, losing 3 first-round picks, but again, loaded this year with more 4 and 5 stars. Denzel Ward is a guy that we saw plenty of last year with 23 tackles, and beyond that, he was on the field despite missing a couple games. Your thoughts about Denzel Ward coming into 2017 and the role he may play?
It would probably be a shock to most people outside of the Buckeye world that if I told you that there was a sophomore last year that split time pretty 50-50 with 2 first-round picks. Denzel Ward was that guy where he didn't make any there was no, shining moments type of plays. He was just a solid corner last year. He was a sophomore learning under 2 greats. With Lattimore leaving, with Conley leaving, Ward's going to jump into that number 1 cornerback type of role. He's going to take everything he learned these past 2 years playing with so many first round and second round type of guys for the Buckeyes. It's just crazy the amount of talent that they've had come through. So he's going to be Coach Coombs' next guy. Ward's going to go in there and be the number 1 corner, build on his great sophomore year where he sat and co-started with those 2 first-round picks. Last year he had 9 pass deflections, which was good for 10th in the Big Ten. So, the talent is there. Denzel Ward's got the speed. He's another 4-star guy, another Ohio kid. All 3 of these guys that I think will be the breakout guys are all from Ohio. So that's just great for Buckeye recruiting. It's great for the fan base. And I think Denzel Ward's going to be that next guy that steps in and is just that shutdown corner that the Buckeyes need back there, especially next year.
We talk Ohio State football each and every Wednesday night with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry. Brandon, I thought it was insane when I heard the Vegas over-under last year concerning Ohio State victories at 8 or 8.5. I actually believe it was 8 even, and I thought if I could pull a Brinks truck to the back of the MGM Grand and think I've got to go 7-5 to lose. If they go 8-4, I push and I'm okay. I get my money back. I just thought that was insane. And I went through the rest of the country and thought, okay, that's fair. That's fair. That's fair. That's fair. Vegas usually knows what it's doing. But this team was in some regards very underestimated last year. So that was kind of Vegas's bold prediction in my book last year. But you're telling me you got some bold predictions for us heading into 2017. So I'm very eager to hear your bold predictions, Brandon, because I'll probably either pat you on the back or say, are you kidding me? You're crazy.
Yeah. So, I've made it very clear that I'm very excited about Kevin Wilson coming to the Buckeyes. I think he's going to do great things for the offense. So my bold predictions are kind of offensive heavy. First one is going to be about Mike Weber. I think Mike Weber is going to make a huge jump this year. And I think Mike Weber is going to rush for over 1,200 yards from last year where he was in the high 900s. And I think he'll get over 10 touchdowns. We think of Kevin Wilson's offenses as very pass heavy, just high scoring. But you look at what he did with guys like Tevin Coleman, where Tevin Coleman ran for 2,000 plus yards, ran for 15 touchdowns. Divine Redding, who averaged about 1,100 yards each season under Wilson and almost 10 touchdowns. So I don't think Mike Weber's quite on Tevin Coleman's level yet. I think he's above Redding's. I think solidly somewhere in there, 1,200 plus yards, 15 or 10 touchdowns for him, I think will be what we see next year going forward.
You could also throw Jordan Howard into that mix, recent Indiana back who's moved on to the Chicago Bears and is a pretty good player already, just in his rookie campaign, I believe, just in 2016 in Chicago. Brandon Zimmerman's bold predictions. We've heard number one. We go to number two. What do you got, Brandon?
Number two, this one may shock some, but he's another guy that I was huge on all year last year, kind of sits back, is really, if you ask most Buckeyes, probably they would consider him the fourth best at his position. But I think Jalen Holmes will lead the Buckeyes in sacks next year. He sits behind guys like Tyquan Lewis, Sam Hubbard, Nick Bosa, who everyone thinks are their big-time guys. But Jalen Holmes last year was a dominant force when he was in there. I think he only wound up with 2 sacks. But there were so many more times where he was just a half second too late. And I think this year, Jalen Holmes is really going to become a force on the defensive line. He's not going to be the forgotten guy this year. And I see, a few other people are kind of jumping on this too. And I think Jalen Holmes will lead the Buckeyes in sacks next year.
Sack totals can be difficult. It's not necessarily the best pass rusher. It typically is. If you get the most sacks, you can kind of extrapolate that if somebody gets to the quarterback 10 or 12 times a year, that they've also pressured him another proportionate of times that's more than the guy that got 3 or 4 sacks. That's typically the case. But like you mentioned, Jalen Holmes was a force more than just a few times last season. 9 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, should improve upon that. And as we mentioned with talking about Jerome Baker earlier, he should qualify as a guy who's not going to get the kind of Joey Bosa treatment, who went from like 12 or 13 sacks, something in that range, maybe more than that, his sophomore season, and then took a tumble and was just as effective, just as dominant, tying up blockers, had a ton of tackles for loss that last season in Columbus, but the sack total went way down, and Joey Bosa was off the charts, and the NFL scouts saw it as well.
And that is what was always funny, because he did drop down in his junior year. I think he wound up like 5.5 sacks or something, and everyone thought that he had this major drop off. But when you actually watch the games, Bosa was being a triple team, and he was still a force with all 3 guys on him, and it led to guys like Tyquan Lewis lead the team in sacks because they're going one-on-one and Bosa's on 3 people. So yeah, you're right, sacks are misleading, and I think they are, and they aren't the only stat that makes somebody a dominant defensive end, which I think is the case with Jalen Holmes last year, where he was a lot more dominant than any stats show for people that watch the game. And I think next year it's, he's going to get a better chance, I think, because Nick Bosa has another year of growing. Sam Hubbard has another year of growing at the defensive end spot. And with Lewis coming back, he's kind of the forgotten guy. And I think he's going to be left one-on-one quite a bit and be able to wreak some havoc.
All right, it's another Ohio State Wednesday night here at Mark Rogers TV. We sit down with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry to talk Buckeyes football. Brandon has given us his 2 bold predictions. He's got 1 left, so check out those segments. Bold prediction number 3, Brandon.
Number 3, this is where a large portion of Buckeye Nation probably will want to fight me, but I think that JT Barrett has a great year, throws for 3,000 plus yards and over 30 touchdowns. He came close to doing that his freshman year. Last year, he threw 20 plus touchdowns. Offense, I think we're going to see a lot less running from Barrett. I think Weber's going to pick up the slack there. McCall will. But you look at what Kevin Wilson's able to do with quarterbacks, and I think it's pretty safe to say that JT Barrett's going to have his best year as a quarterback statistic-wise. You look at, Sam Bradford was on a different level in college. He threw for 4,700 plus yards and 50 touchdowns in 1 year. Look at a guy like Nate Sudfeld, who, wasn't anything spectacular, but in Kevin Wilson's offense, he threw for 3,500 plus yards and 27 touchdowns in the 1 year that he started. So JT Barrett's a lot better than Sudfeld, has a lot better talent. So I think it's kind of safe to assume that he'll get 3,000 yards passing and 30 touchdowns. I know a lot of people wish that he would just be benched and Joey Burrow or Dwayne Haskins. I'm not that guy. I never have been. I've been shouting that, since the season ended against Clemson. I think JT Barrett has a great year, and I think he makes a push to go to New York and be a Heisman finalist this year.
All right. Yeah. Everybody seems to be down on JT Barrett and forgetting what he accomplished and how good he was. Just anticipating throws, throwing in tight windows, extremely accurate, extremely poised his first couple seasons in Columbus. Yeah, something wasn't quite right. And the supporting cast certainly let him down last year. So he threw for 2,500 and change last year. So really to get to 3,000 is pretty significant. You're talking about like a fifth of his total added on to his passing total last year. 30 touchdowns would be a significant increase as well. It doesn't seem like a 24 to 6 or 24 adding 6 to get to 30, but it really is, because again, it's another quarter on to his touchdown total. I would think Ohio State fans are caring more a little bit about where those touchdowns and those passing yards are going to come. Forget the 425 spot against a MAC opponent with 6 touchdown passes. Give us the 3 touchdowns and 275 against Penn State when they come to town. So we'll see. But if he gets the Heisman Trophy finalist status and trip to New York, then that's going to tell us that, the games were well played against the Oklahomas and Penn States and Michigans.
And I think this year, along with adding in Kevin Wilson and his style, I think Ohio State's going to be a lot less likely to abandon the pass early like they were last year. There were a few games last year where, it was windy or it was rainy or JT Barrett, almost threw a pick on his first throw. And it seemed like Warner and Tim Beck just kind of shut down the offense and put the passing playbook to the side and just relied on Barrett to run and Weber to run and Curtis Samuel because they had those weapons. I feel like Kevin Wilson's not going to throw away the passing playbook as early this year, and I think that's why JT Barrett's going to be able to throw for a lot more yards than he did last year.
Okay, I'm going to say in order that the Holmes prediction may be the boldest just because he's competing for sacks with a ton of guys on that defense that are extremely talented. Mike Weber getting to 1,200 yards, I'm going to say that that's the most likely in my book that he gets to 1,200 with 10 touchdowns because Urban Meyer, despite the presence of Kevin Wilson, wants to run the ball first and foremost. JT Barrett with 3,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. If they get into a shootout with Oklahoma and a few other teams and they really need him, he could have an extremely efficient season and they could go undefeated and he could miss those marks, especially the yardage total. They're going to score points, but the yardage totals may not be as significant or needed for JT Barrett if they're dominant elsewhere. But we'll see how the schedule plays out and how much JT Barrett is needed to come up big in those games and also how he does respond in those situations.
Yep.
All right. Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry talking Ohio State football with us each and every Wednesday night. Brandon, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.